Okay, welcome everybody. I'm glad you could join me today for our webinar about maximizing your investment returns using a Roth IRA. My name is Clay Malcolm, and I'm going to be your host for the presentation today. I certainly invite you to type questions into the question box on your console. I'm happy to answer those at the end of the presentation. I would like for this information to be functional for you and so that you can put it into your strategy. So please do ask any questions that would help you to do that. I did put one handout in your console, which is a little piece I did recently about some interesting Roth IRA strategies, so that you can refer back to that. And this will be recorded, so you can always take a look at it on our YouTube channel at your convenience. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So this is me. I've been in the self-directed IRA business for about 10 or 11 years. And, you know, I'm obviously a professional in the business, but I'm also a self-directed IRA investor, and I'm active at it. And so I really have a sense of, you know, what we go through as self-directed IRA investors, finding investments, choosing the right account type for a particular investment, and the process that goes into that. So, for lack of a better way to put it, I guess I'm one of you. I'm one of us. So, you know, any questions that you have that I can help you with, I may have gone through that same thing that you're going through. So please do feel free to reach out to me at your convenience. I will obviously specify that all the information in this presentation is for education purposes only. At Advanta IRA, we do not give tax, legal, or investment advice. We don't advocate any particular investment strategy, investment vendor, and we certainly encourage you to use your financial team and any advisors that you have when you are doing the due diligence on a particular investment. In the self-directed IRA account world that we're going to be talking about today, where we're talking about IRAs purchasing private investments, the due diligence process is incumbent upon the account holder. So again, we don't vet investments. We don't sell any investments. We're a very neutral part of the equation. Our job is to document the activity in your account so that you get to keep the tax benefits. But we are not vetting any of the investments, so that really falls on you as the account holder. And please feel free to engage your team when you're doing that, whether it's an attorney or a CPA or some other advisor. And a little bit about Advanta, and we are going to start this presentation with some kind of basic information and then get into things that are a little bit more complex. But Advanta is actually a company that is a self-directed IRA provider, and we're built around customer service. So there's a lot of experience amongst our staff. We've been around for almost 20 years. We're a bit of a medium-sized company in the self-directed IRA space. We have about $1.8 billion that we are doing the administration and bookkeeping for those accounts. And you know, the way that we're set up, each account holder gets a two-person team. So that's usually an education and onboarding person like myself or one of my colleagues, and then also an account manager that's dedicated to your account. So you do have a two-person team, and the account manager typically handles the nuts and bolts and paperwork of particular investments and things like that. So they kind of follow your account along. So if you ever have any questions, then you can call them about those types of questions. So this two-man team, obviously you have our email, you have our phone number, so you never don't know where to go if you have a question and you have a team that is specific to your account. All right, so some of that housekeeping out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about what we're talking about. And at its very core, we're talking about self-directed IRA plans and self-directed IRA investing. Now, the whole term self-directed has gotten a little bit confusing because it's been used for a number of different things. So do understand that when you hear the idea of the word self-directed, what they're really talking about is the ability for the account holder to make some decisions about what kind of assets they're going to have in their plan, in their account. So a self-directed IRA at a Schwab or a Fidelity probably means that you get to choose from between some stocks and mutual funds and maybe ETFs. I'm not quite sure, but the fact that you as the account holder are making decisions on which of those publicly traded securities that you want in your account means that that plan is self-directed. Self-directed is really just a marketing term or a descriptive term. That said, I will say that more often than not, people are using the term self-directed to mean an IRA or an account that is investing in quote-unquote alternative assets or private assets or hard assets. So the reason I point this out, of course, is because the account types themselves stay the same, right? So because self-directed account is not a different account type, the account types stay the same. So it's going to be a traditional or a Roth or a SEP IRA or a simple or a solo 401k, any of these kind of plans that you see on your screen here, that's going to determine the contribution rules, the distribution rules, and the tax advantage. And at a company like Advanta, obviously what we're offering is the ability to combine the tax advantages of those account types with alternative assets. And so in the case of Advanta, we handle almost everything that is available from a legal perspective. So real estate, you can do private lending, private placements, precious metals, cryptocurrency, almost anything that you know how to make money at outside of your IRA, you can make money at inside your IRA, as long as you take the time to set it up properly. Now, there are some rules, of course, but generally speaking, if you have an expertise, you get to exercise it in service of your account and hopefully make more money for your retirement. The asset choices, just so, again, the lay of the land kind of thing, asset choices that are available to you are determined by the custodian. So I mentioned the fact that you can have a self-directed IRA at a Schwab or Fidelity, but generally speaking, you're only going to be able to access publicly traded securities because that's all they service. Same thing with, and I guess in contrast to that, with Advanta, we don't really do publicly traded securities very well, and we specialize in the alternatives. But understand that the IRS does not say to custodians, you have to handle every asset that is legal. The custodian actually chooses which assets they're going to service. So that being the case, it's not uncommon for us to have a client who also has an account at a bank or an IRA at a bank or brokerage house in order to invest in publicly traded securities. And as mentioned here on the screen, you can have multiple IRAs functioning simultaneously, and you can move money about via rollovers and transfers relatively easily in terms of the ability for the money or the funds to move from one account custodian to another. And the reason obviously you would do that is to access a particular investment type. And again, going back to core principles, remember that what we're really talking about here is the proposition that the IRS is giving us. And so what we're doing is we're contributing money to an account. The returns, the earnings on that are tax deferred, which means that they can compound faster. If I make a $100,000 investment and I make $20,000 on it in a couple of years, so first of all, good for me. But the second thing is that entire $120,000 that's in the account, that's in my IRA, can be reinvested. And hopefully then, because of the entire amount is being reinvested, the ability for that money to compound will be greater. So if I was making that investment outside of my IRA, I might have made the $20,000 on the investment, but some of that $20,000 profit would get chipped away by taxes. And so my next investment would be $115,000 or something like that. And it seems like a very small amount when you do it in a single scenario, but as that builds over time, and time is that third element that you see there, that ability for the account and the tax deferred status to compound will start to build on itself, and it can make an enormous difference in the long run. And again, so these things, you contribute some money to the account, we invest, the returns are tax deferred so they can be redeployed, and over time, the idea would be that it would create wealth for us. And so at this point, let's talk about the differences. Let's start to delve into the differences between the accounts. So that that mechanism that we just talked about on the last slide, that occurs in both traditional IRA tax format as well as Roth IRA tax format. And so let's be specific about what those are, because they are slightly different tax tools. And I always think of the account types as a tax tool. So the tax tool that is characterized by pre-tax money in, meaning those are the contributions. So when you put new money into an account, that's an annual contribution. In a pre-tax type of account, that means you either get a deduction for that amount that you contributed, or in a lot of cases, it's deducted from your pay even before it becomes seen as earnings. So it's either deducted without being taxed, or you get a deduction when you file your tax return. So that's pre-tax money in. So you earned $1 and you got to take that entire dollar and contribute it to your account. And the tax deferred status in the middle, again, we talked about that. That applies to all of these account types. And then it's taxed at distribution. So in a lot of ways, people will often say that the tax occurs in this pre-tax kind of format, the traditional IRA format, on the fruit of the account. In other words, the overall amount of the account at the time of distribution. So the account types that have this traditional IRA tax status are many. It's a traditional IRA, a SEP IRA, a simple IRA, and most 401k plans and other retirement plans, well, all of them offer this pre-tax status. Now, some of those plans also allow for a Roth IRA style status, which we'll get to in the next box there. But when I say traditional IRA, remember that the tax status, the tax advantage that is associated with these account types, it's all the same tax status. Now, in contrast to traditional IRAs, and before I do that, let me just say this. So the idea, I think, behind traditional IRAs when they were created in the 70s was, if I'm in my earning prime, that means I'm probably in a relatively high income tax bracket, right? So the ability for me to make a contribution and reduce the amount of money that I'm seeing as having been made, the deduction that I get, can be very helpful, right? Because that could reduce my taxes in that year, right? So getting that deduction or having that pre-tax money taken out of my earnings while I'm in my earning prime is a really good benefit, right? So in your earning prime, you make contributions, and so that helps you in that tax year quite a bit. Then obviously the length of the time that you have the money in the account, obviously you're hoping that it's growing. That's no guarantee, right? So I've made a lot of 401k and IRA investments that didn't make a lot of money and even lost money. That's always a possibility. Certainly in 2008, 2009, I got clobbered. I don't know about you guys, but in any event, the thought being that then if you've had that money growing and not having had it taxed at all, when you start to take distributions, perhaps you're working less or you're not working at all, so you might be in a much lower income tax bracket. So the actual tax rate that you pay on distributions might be lower than the tax rate that you would have paid on the earnings themselves when you made them back in your earning prime. So it's a very elegant kind of solution and a way for people to be able to get the money to compound faster and hopefully be taxed at a rate that's less than your kind of maximum income tax rate, whatever it is in your earning prime. Okay, so now let's go to the contrast to Roth. So the Roth IRA tax format flips the script when it comes to when the tax event is. Instead of the tax event being at the end, like it is in the traditional IRA tax format, the tax is at the beginning. So you're, in our analogy of kind of the tree, you're paying tax on the seed and not the fruit, whereas in the traditional IRA format, you're paying tax on the fruit. So when you make a contribution to a Roth, and this does, if your 401k plan, the actual plan document allows for it, your employee contributions can be in the Roth format. That means that you make some earnings, you make that dollar, but whatever taxation that your whatever income tax rate, and also of course Social Security and that kind of stuff, that gets taken out of that dollar. So maybe you have 70 cents left, but that amount that you're putting in has already been taxed, right? So when you make a contribution to a Roth, it's post-tax money. Now, the earnings and the investments, while the money is in the account, are again tax deferred. But when you take a qualified distribution from a Roth, there's no tax at distribution, right? So because you pay the tax rate at the very beginning. So it flips the switch. Now, keep in mind that the income tax rate, the tax rate that you paid, might have occurred at your earning prime. And so the income tax rate that you pay on the money that you contribute to a Roth might be rather high or relatively high, depending upon your individual circumstances. But it also does mean that all the earnings can, in a lot of cases, be tax-free as long as it's qualified distribution. So that's really the biggest switch, is that when the tax event occurs, and are you paying tax on the seed for that account, the seed money for the account, or are you paying tax on the fruit? And neither one of them is necessarily better, and certainly one can outperform the other in a given scenario. So it is important to understand what the differences are and when maybe to deploy one versus another. And then I couldn't help myself. I had to put the HSA in this, since we're talking about tax advantages, because HSA's tax advantages are kind of unsurpassed. It's pre-tax money in, so you get a deduction for whatever you put in, and there's no tax at distribution if it's for a qualified medical expense. And of course, it does have the tax deferred status in the middle. So the net effect of that is that if you contribute to an HSA and you invest it and it makes money, those earnings, you're likely to never pay tax on that. It's kind of one of the only, it's tax-free money. I mean, it's really a remarkable thing. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on HSAs today. By the way, HSA is an acronym for Health Savings Account, and you do have to have a high deductible health plan in order to make contributions, so it's not as widespread. But do understand that it's out there, and if you're eligible for it, definitely look into it because it has an incredible set of tax advantages. Okay, back to basic principles again. Remember that the IRS is making a deal with us when they offer us these accounts, and the idea would be obviously that they want us to utilize the accounts so that we will have money for retirement, and they do that for a variety of reasons. But they are making a deal with us, and the deal is pretty much this: they're going to give us these tax advantages of the account for years or even decades, as long as we do two things. You have to have a qualified custodian for IRAs. Now, 401k plans and other types of retirement plans, it's usually a trustee, it's not a custodian. But for IRAs, you always have to have a custodian. And then the second thing is you have to follow the rules, right? So there's contribution rules about new money in, there's distribution rules about when you take the money out, and then there's disqualified persons and prohibited transactions. Now, we're not going to go into that today. There's lots of information about that on our website, and it's relatively easy to get the information about disqualified persons and prohibited transactions. But do understand that there are certain persons that have some restrictions in the way that they interact with the IRA's cash and assets, right? So it's an important thing to look into. But assuming we follow those rules, the IRS is going to give us the tax advantages that are associated with the particular account type. Now, because they're giving us different tax status on a certain specified amount of money, they're going to want to keep that separate, right? Because they want to make sure that they understand the difference between what is my personal finances, which is one tax status, and what is my IRA's money, because it is a different tax status. And if I have a traditional and a Roth, they're going to want to keep those separate as well because of the different tax status. So do understand that when your IRA is making an investment, an IRA is a legal and financial entity, and it's separate from your personal finances. It has its own bank account, has its own tax ID number, has its own name. So anytime you're making these self-directed IRA investments in private assets, all of the paperwork and the ownership is in the name of the IRA, not you personally. And keep in mind that what's happening here, part of the reason that the IRS requires a custodian for your IRA is we're part of the tracking mechanism. We file a Form 5498 every year with the IRS for each IRA, and basically it says this is the total value of the account, and it has some categorization of assets in it. And what's happening here is the IRS is tracking that money. This is another reason why you need an experienced custodian in particular with these private investments, because our job is to make sure that we document all the activity in the account so that you keep the tax benefits. So, make no mistake, we as the custodian are part of the IRS's tracking mechanism for this money, and one of the reasons why it's required. And also, so I mentioned that traditional and Roth will always be kept separate, and so will HSAs. And just a reminder that the account type determines the contribution rules, the distribution rules, and the tax status. And I mentioned before that there's lots of ability for you to move accounts, move money from one account to another. I have, I can't remember, three traditionals maybe. I think I have 2 traditionals and a simple. I think I have 2 or 3 Roths. Have 2 HSAs. So I might have gone a little overboard. But the ability for me to move my traditional IRA money to a number of custodians, or my HSA to have multiple custodians and have them be in different places. You can see from this rollover chart from the IRS website that there is the ability for you to deploy that money and put it in position where you want it to, so you can make the investments that you want to. All right, so let's take a look at, since we're talking about the sequence of events, let's talk a little bit about the contribution strategy. And the reason I bring this up is because for those of us who have multiple accounts, we may not be able to make the maximum contribution to every single account that we have. So sometimes it's important to think about what sequence you're going to make your contributions, in which you're going to make your contributions. So this is one strategy. It's not, by any means, it's not the only strategy, but it's certainly something I hear from account holders. They look at, if they have multiple accounts, they'll think, okay, well, I have a 401k or a simple IRA, and my employer is going to do some matching. And so what that basically means is you're doubling your money. It's free money, in a manner of speaking. So that tends to be a pretty great investment return right off the bat. So making your contributions up to whatever level it's being matched by your employer is a pretty logical first step. If you have an HSA, a lot of people will then move their contribution funds to HSAs because the tax benefits are better. And again, if you don't have one, that's fine. Just take that out of the equation. But do think about the fact that if you do have one or have the ability to get one. Lots of people will then go to their 401k or their simple because it's a higher contribution, annual contribution limit than just a traditional or a Roth IRA. So the ability to get more money into a tax advantaged account occurs if you have a 401k or other type of retirement plan. Like, again, there's any number of them. There's thrift savings plan, 401a, 403b, 457, defined benefit, defined contribution, so on and so forth. And then at some point, if they have the ability to, people will also make a contribution to a Roth. Now, and the reason for that is because that money will never have tax associated with the earnings. So it's kind of a gross taxation strategy, and it can be on top of the other money that you've contributed. So, and the reason for that is because the IRS does have a limit to how much they will let you deduct in any given year. Now that deductibility or deduction limit usually comes into play when you have a 401k and other traditional style tax advantaged accounts. So it's something to ask your CPA about. But you eventually, no matter how many accounts you have, eventually you're going to hit a level where you can no longer deduct any more money from that in that particular tax year. So do understand that exists, and it's something to keep in mind from a strategy perspective. So this is one way that you might allocate your contribution dollars. And just keep in mind, it's a great idea to do an inventory of all your tax advantaged accounts, understand what their characteristics are, and look at what their performance is right now. Because if your IRA is not performing very well, maybe it's time to move some of that IRA at a Schwab or a Fidelity over to a self-directed IRA account where you might be able to get earnings from a real estate investment or cryptocurrency or whatever it is that you're interested in, have expertise in. And I do want to just specify this in terms of just definitions. It's really common for people to misunderstand contribution limits and earnings. So contributions is new money that is injected into the account, and there are annual contribution limits to every account type, right? The IRS is not going to let you just contribute everything you want to into any of the account types. So it's new money introduced into the account, and it is subject to annual limits. Earnings, however, are not, right? So earnings are unlimited. If you have $50,000 in your traditional IRA or your Roth IRA, and that 50 grand you hit a home run and it makes 200,000 in a year, that's totally fine. There's no limit to that. So understand that the place where there are annual limits is contributions, but it's not the earnings. Once money has been contributed to the account, it's able to earn as much as you can make it earn. Okay. So again, not subject to annual limits. I'm not sure why my animation was so cranky there. All right. Now we talked a little bit about the difference between traditional and Roth, but I'm going to go into a little bit of detail here, and then we'll talk about some more strategy things. So traditional IRA, really the criteria for contributing to your traditional is anyone with earned income is eligible to contribute, and you have to have as much earned income as you contribute. So in other words, if you only have $3,000 worth of earned income in a given tax year, that's the limit that you can contribute. And as I mentioned before, deductibility may be limited based on your other accounts and your income and so on and so forth. The benefits are you get a tax deduction in the current tax year, you get tax deferred growth. Again, we talked about the fact that you can move your accounts, pre-tax money, into several different accounts, usually without a whole lot of restriction. Simple IRAs do have a 2-year rule that's important to think about, but you do have the ability to move that money around and deploy it in many circumstances. Talking about the distribution rules, remember that at 59.5, so we talked about contribution and then tax deferred status in the middle. When you do start to take distributions, if you take distribution before age 59.5, there's a 10% early withdrawal penalty unless you meet the criteria for exceptions that you see there: higher education, disability, et cetera, et cetera. And do understand too that when you take a distribution, whatever that gross amount of the distribution is, so whatever the dollar value is in that tax year, is going to be taxed at the income tax rate that you are in that tax year. So you're basically just adding income to your income tax report in that year, and it'll be taxed at whatever income tax rate you are. At age 72, the IRS has let you have, in a traditional IRA, they've let you have this money, again, for years or decades, and it has not been taxed. Remember, it was pre-tax first as you put it in as a contribution, and then the earnings weren't taxed either. So by the time you get to age 72, the IRS is just freaking out. They just want their tax money. And so they're going to require you to start taking distributions at that age, that year, and then each year subsequent to that, as a fractional piece of the account has to be taken out each year thereafter. Remember that rules for inherited IRAs are different. Even if, whether it was a traditional or Roth, the rules for inherited IRAs are a little different. If you're the spouse and you're the sole beneficiary, you basically can just make that account your own. But if you're a non-spouse beneficiary, generally speaking, you're going to fall into the category where you have to take distribution within 10 years. So these are all great things to learn the detail of if you have an inherited IRA. Now, to reiterate again for the Roth, it's a little bit different. Oh, and there are no Rmds for, let's go back to this for a sec, there are no Rmds for Roth IRAs. Now, the reason for that, of course, is I mentioned that at 72, the IRS has let you have traditional IRA money for a long time without taxing it. Well, the Roth IRA, the IRS has already got the tax that they're going to get from that account, so they don't require you to take it out in RMD fashion, because they're not going to get any taxes from that anyway, right? So again, getting into the mind of the IRS, it's a little bit of a scary place. So remember that Roth IRAs, anyone with earned income can contribute as long as they don't exceed the income limit. So at a certain amount of income, the IRS says you can no longer make an annual contribution to the Roth in that tax year. Now, if the next year you don't exceed the limit, you can make a contribution. So it goes year by year. Remember that it's tax-free on the earnings and no taxation for qualified distributions. There's no mandatory distributions, no RMDs. And thinking about when to contribute to a Roth, or we're going to get into traditional to Roth conversions here in a minute. It's always a good idea to think about what is your income tax rate in a given tax year, and where is that in comparison to where you'll be next year, or the year, maybe years past as well. But more in service of, you always want to pay the tax at the least rate you can. And so, thinking about what tax rate you're in a given tax year, it's always a good exercise to do. And one of the things that I do see people, and I think we have this in a couple of different slides, is if you're not eligible to contribute to a Roth in a given tax year, some people will just make the contribution to a traditional if they're eligible to do that, and then they will convert that traditional IRA to Roth, and that is available. And the rules for that are very liberal at the moment. We're going to talk about it in a second here. And we're not going to go through this whole history of Roths, but it is kind of interesting. So traditional IRAs were the first, and then Roths really didn't come around until 1997. And the Roth components of 401ks didn't come out until 2006. So there has been a movement and an ability for you to get into this Roth IRA tax format that has, come along later. It was Senator Roth who introduced the bill, and so we can all thank him if we're going to use a Roth IRA. And I mentioned that there are income limits for folks in order to be able to contribute to a Roth IRA in a given tax year. This is 2020. I don't think it changed for 2021, although I didn't look it up today, so I apologize for that. But it's easy to find in the IRS website. So if you make under 124,000 and you're filing as a single individual, then you are eligible to contribute the maximum to your Roth. If you fall into that 124 to 139, then you might be able to contribute some of the amount, but not the maximum. And if you're over 139,000, then you can't contribute to a Roth. For married filing a joint income tax returns, that the lower part of the threshold is 196, the upper is 206, and then above that there's no contributions. And then for married filing separate returns, if you can claim no income, then you actually but somehow you have earned income, you can make contributions. The 0 to 10,000 is the part where you can make some contributions, but probably will not. Well, you will not be able to contribute to the maximum. And over 10, that's too high, so you wouldn't be able to contribute to a Roth. And so, just to give you a visual of the traditional IRA distributions. So before 59.5, you have the 10% early distribution penalty, unless you meet one of the exceptions. Between 59.5 and 70.5, your distribution strategy is up to you. You have complete ability. You could distribute all of it. You can distribute some of it. You can distribute none of it. You're in complete control when it comes to that span of time between 59.5 and 72. And at 72, you do have to start required minimum distribution. So again, take your first distribution. It's a fractional piece of the total account value, and you have to do that each year thereafter. If you have multiple traditional IRAs, you do not have to take an RMD out of each IRA. The IRS sees all of your traditionals as one account, so you would calculate your total RMD, and if you wanted to take that RMD out of just one account, you can. And all distributions can be made in cash or in kind. So because we're talking about private and hard assets and alternative assets, let's say you have a piece of real estate or some gold coins or something like that, you can distribute that actual thing rather than liquidating it into cash and distributing cash. The rules are the same, so it's the value of that thing. So it does have to be appraised in the year of the distribution. So it doesn't change the tax part of it. What it does change is the ability for you to not lose control of that physical asset. And this is particularly interesting when it comes to real estate. And I'll give you one of the 6 kind of cool things, strategies that are on that handout in the console there. You know, it's not an uncommon strategy for somebody to take an IRA, whether it's a traditional or a Roth, and buy their eventual retirement home using their IRA money. And sometimes they do that in their 40s or 50s. I mean, if they're far-sighted enough, I mean, it could be the 30s or 20s. But the idea is the IRA can purchase a property. Now, while the IRA owns it, it does have to be an investment property, so it's a rental, and you as the account holder and some of your family members can't use it for your own personal use. But it does mean that it's titled in the name of the IRA. So you as the account holder have control of that piece of real estate. So as the years go by and maybe prices go up, or there's some, maybe it becomes very popular, and when you get to over 60 or whenever you're going to take distribution, you don't have to go looking around for your retirement home. You can actually just distribute it to yourself. So in that way, you never lose control of that property. So again, an IRA that owns real estate, that property is titled in the name of the IRA. And when you take distribution, all it is a retitling exercise. So instead of you're going to retitle it from the name of your IRA to your name personally, if it's in a traditional IRA, you're going to pay the tax on the value, the appraised value of that real estate. If it's in a Roth IRA and it's a qualified distribution, there's no tax. You just change the titling on the property, and whether it's traditional or Roth, once the real estate that was in the IRA is 100% distributed, then all of the use rules go away. So you can actually, move into the place and use it as your retirement home. So there is a distinction between when the IRA owns it and when you take distribution of it in terms of IRS rules. But the beauty of that strategy, and the thing that I thought was very clever about the account holders that use that, is that they got control of a property that they knew that they were going to want later, but they got control of it well ahead of time. So when they got to retirement age, they didn't have to go out to wherever that place was and get into the housing market or the marketplace there to find their retirement home. They already had it, which I think is, it's just, again, it's taking a look at the rules and using them to their best effect for your own personal strategy. Okay, so Roth distribution rules, as in comparison to the traditional Roth distribution rules, are actually a little more complex than traditional. You do have that 10% early withdrawal penalty under 59.5, unless you are taking distribution of what had previously been an annual contribution. You can make an annual contribution to a Roth and take distribution of it at any time without tax or penalty. And of course, the reason is because you've already paid tax on it. Now, that does not apply to the earnings that money made while it was in the account. But the actual annual contribution amount, let's say you contributed $12,000 to a Roth over 2 years, and let's say that was several years ago, and you want to take that $12,000 out, you can without tax and without penalty, even if you're not 59.5, because it was an annual contribution. Now, the earnings on those contributions, that's a different story, right? The general rules for qualified distributions, and obviously this is important because that means it's tax-free. The two basic rules are, number one, that the account has been open for at least 5 years, and number two, that you're over 59.5. And just as with traditionals, there are special exceptions to the 10% penalty, rule, and you see them on your screen there. They're the same as the traditional. But for everything in the account to be distributed tax-free, you would need to be over 59.5 and the account been open for at least 5 years. And if you've made conversions, then the conversions would have to have been at least 5 years ago as well for everything to be tax-free. But there is an order for Roth distributions, and the way that it goes is first out is contributions, and as contributions are distributed first in, first out. So you may be able to take some distribution of some of the amount in your Roth now, no matter what age you are, without tax and without penalty, as long as it doesn't exceed the amount that you have been making as annual contributions. Conversions, as I mentioned, that means you shifted from pre-tax money to post-tax money kind of midstream. Each conversion amount has its own 5-year rule. for the earnings, right? So understand that, again, tax-free distributions of everything in the account, that would mean that all your conversions are also aged at least 5 years. And then in the ordering of Roth distributions, earnings are distributed last. So again, Roth distributions are somewhat more complex when it comes to the amount that you're taking out. Now the rules from a timeline perspective are not more complex, they're less complex, right? So 59.5, there's that threshold age where you may incur a 10% early distribution penalty, again, not on annual contributions. But after that, that's when you have full control. There's no penalty for distributions, 10% penalty, no 10% penalty for distributions, and there's no RMDs, again, because the IRS knows they're not going to get any tax money out of this distribution anyway. So 72 comes and goes and with no effect. So that's going to lead to some of the strategies that we talk about here in a moment, but well, I'll leave them until we get there. Okay. So getting funds into a Roth format. Again, just to keep kind of hammering at this because it is a source of confusion, you are going to have annual contribution limits. So the amount that you can get in there, new money directly into a Roth. Now, one of the things that I will specify is that in 401k plans and other retirement plans, because if the plan allows for it, the Roth provision applies to your quote unquote employee contributions. Well, your employee contributions to a 401k are much larger than the 6,000 or 7,000 if you're over 50 that you would be able to contribute to a Roth IRA. So if you're looking to get more money into a Roth faster, and you have the ability to make contributions in the Roth format in your 401k, you will likely be able to make a higher amount of Roth contributions in a given tax year if you're using a 401k. Now, the other thing that you can do is make contributions to a traditional IRA style tax formatted account and then make conversions, because at the moment, there are no restrictions to the amount that you convert. It doesn't matter how much money you make, right? So the amount of money you make is important when it comes to whether you can contribute to a Roth or not. But that amount of money that you make does not apply to conversions at the moment. It doesn't matter how much money you make, you're able to convert money from traditional to Roth. And this is largely a function of the fact that the IRS wants to collect more money right now. And so they made the rules easier for us to convert so that they can collect more money, because obviously a conversion is a taxable event. So do understand that there's a distinction between the amount of money that you can contribute and when you can contribute and when you can make a conversion. Oh, that should have been up there first. Are there limits to the amount? Yes for contributions, no for conversions at the moment. All right, so let's talk about conversions. So we're talking about the idea of moving money from pre-tax to post-tax. So you've made contributions to a traditional IRA or a SEP or a simple or an old 401k. Remember that 401ks where you are no longer employed, so that's what I'm saying is an old 401k. If you're no longer employed there, that money is automatically mobile, meaning it can be rolled over without tax and without penalty to a traditional IRA, or in some cases a different type of an account. And if you've made Roth contributions to that 401k because it allowed it, you can also roll that money out into a Roth IRA. So an old 401k where you're no longer employed has automatic ability to be rolled over without tax and without penalty. Now, so let's say you have money in a traditional IRA and you want to convert it to a Roth, and there's a number of reasons why you might do this. So let's just talk about the mechanics. Basically, in the year of the conversion, whatever gross dollar value or amount that you convert, if it's cash, it's the dollar amount, and if it's an in-kind conversion, which is possible, that's the value of what you convert. That is going to go onto your income tax in the year of the conversion. So again, thinking about what your income tax rate is at the moment and evaluating whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for you is an important thing. And also, because you're going to be adding onto your income, one of the things you might look out for is whether that's going to bump you up into a higher tax bracket. So do consult with your tax person anytime you're thinking about making a conversion, because it can definitely have an effect. One of the things that I will also say, just because I can't I can't wait to jump the gun on this one, is that sometimes account holders will think about, okay, well, I took in my personal tax world in a given tax year, I took a loss on a personal investment. So I'm declaring a loss either because of, I'm taking depreciation, or I actually had a loss that I and am taking in that given tax year. Well, that might be a good year to make a conversion, because the net effect of it is that if you convert the same amount as the loss, that's kind of a net zero in terms of your tax obligation. So not only are you looking at, in a given tax year, not only are you looking at what your income tax rate is to kind of figure out what your strategy is, but also, do you have losses or other kind of mitigating factors that might help you when you're thinking about making a conversion. And that's really it. The thought process or the mechanics is really the raw amount of the conversion is going to go on your income for that tax year, and then you have paid the tax rate on it. So thereafter, all the earnings, again, assuming you make a qualified distribution at some point, all the earnings will be tax-free. So you're paying the taxes now rather than later. I mentioned the fact that everybody's able to convert. Remember that traditional IRA tax status accounts can be converted to a Roth. I've actually seen a number of people who, especially those who are self-employed, sometimes they will have a SEP IRA, and the reason that they would have that is because the annual contribution limits are much, much higher. They're well over $50,000 a year instead of, again, $6,000 or $7,000 for a traditional or a Roth. So it has to be in the traditional IRA format, the contributions that you make to a SEP. But I've certainly seen people make a maximum contribution to a SEP IRA because they made enough money to do that, and then the next day or the next week they just converted it to Roth. So again, if your overall financial or tax strategy is to get more money into a Roth format, think about other account types like a 401k that I was mentioning earlier, or a SEP IRA or a simple IRA that has higher annual contribution limits that could then be possibly converted. You can convert full, do partial or full. So if you have an account, that you get to choose the amount of the conversion. It does not have to be a full account. So whatever dollar value or value you wanted to convert, you can. The conversions is in a tax year. The conversion has to take place in the tax year, and the valuation of the asset is in that tax year. I mentioned the fact that it does add to your taxable income in that year. You can't convert from prior years. And again, we talked about the fact that if your AGI is too high, you wouldn't be able to contribute to a Roth, but you certainly could do a conversion. So if you have the ability to convert some money out of a traditional, you could do that. Okay, why convert? And these strategies not only have to do with conversion, but they also have to do with Roth IRAs as in total. And I'll just go back to that first principle again. The traditional IRA tax status and the Roth IRA tax status are both good ones, and they may, in certain circumstances, one may be better than the other. So what we're going to be talking about, especially as it relates to conversions, but also just the general account type, is when is the Roth tool at its best? When does it make the most sense, right? So we're going to talk about that as we move through the next couple of slides. So one thing to consider, I've harped on the idea of looking at your income tax rate in a given tax year, because there's no given that overall income tax rates won't go up, right? So you may be in a relatively high tax rate this year, or you consider it to be, but what if the government made income tax rates higher across the board? So it might be that you are, one of the reasons why people will convert sometimes is they feel like they just want to hedge their bets in terms of the rest of the money that account is going to create. And they don't want to even think about what their income tax bracket will be in the future. That next one there, you have a long time before retirement. Roths shine, obviously, when the earnings that are created by the account are more. And time is one of the elements that usually makes the earnings more. So a Roth IRA for somebody who is in their 20s or 30s has the ability to create earnings for several decades that will all theoretically or hopefully be tax-free, again, assuming qualified distributions. So if you add time to the equation, or if you have a long time before you're going to take distributions, that may start to tip the scales to a Roth versus a traditional, because it has more time to create earnings that won't be taxed, right? When it comes to conversions, I've certainly seen people who have hard assets and they will convert them if those values are depressed. Meaning, I have a piece of real estate, and this is not happening right at the moment, but let's say that the real estate values went down. Let's say, hopefully not like 2008, 2009, but let's say that the value of that asset is much lower today than it might be later. Or let's say you have gold or silver. Maybe it's a depressed value. If you convert it, the tax, first of all, the amount is the value on that day that you do the conversion. So let's say you had a piece of real estate and its value had gone down from, I don't know, 100,000 to 80,000, and you convert it when it's worth 80,000, and then the next 3 years real estate bounces back and it's now worth 120,000. Well, you paid tax on 80,000 and now it's in a Roth, so you won't be paying tax on any of the subsequent earnings. So thinking about that ability to when you pay the taxes and what's going on with your assets and the rest of your financial world, I mean, that can be a huge boon. Ability to pay the taxes on conversion, obviously you have to think about the logistics of all this stuff, because you are creating a tax event. So make sure that you have the ability to pay the tax on the conversion. The next one here is one that I see very frequently, which is that people will use a Roth IRA often if there's some possibility that there will be an outsized return on their small investment, or it doesn't matter whether it's a small investment. If there's a possibility for an outsized return, a Roth can often be the better tool, because what's happening is that all of that return will be possibly tax-free, right? So in a traditional IRA, all those earnings, the outsized return, all of it would still be taxed. Now, again, when you distribute it, it might be at a lower tax rate than your earning prime, but it's still going to be taxed. So all of the money in the account will be taxed. But when it comes to the Roth, or whether it's a Roth conversion or you made contributions to a Roth and then bought an investment that has the possibility for an outsized return, all of a sudden you have the ability for all of that earnings, all the earnings, to be tax-free. So that's a reason for possibly using the Roth tool in a given investment scenario, is this idea of having all the earnings be tax-free. And then generational wealth. So one of the things that we talked about in terms of characteristics of the account is that traditional IRA tax status eventually ends up in required minimum distributions. So as you get older, you're going to have to start depleting the account. Well, let's say that your financial world worked out well and you don't really necessarily need to take distributions from your IRA in order to live, then you might want to keep that money for your heirs, the designated beneficiaries. And do remember that if you designate beneficiaries, that typically speaking will bypass probate. If you don't designate any beneficiaries, often the IRA ends up in probate. So please feel free, or please make sure to think about that you have your beneficiaries up to date, and that you have the appropriate forms at the custodian, because whatever beneficiaries you designate, that's where it's going. So if your life changes, make sure that you change the beneficiaries if that's appropriate. So from a generational wealth perspective, traditional IRAs, at some point you start to have to deplete the account. So in the scenario where you want to pass it down to your beneficiaries, changing or making a conversion to a Roth, or having a Roth, can be the better tool, or the one that's most effective. And I'll just show that, although my animation is horrible there. So this is a traditional to Roth conversion to avoid Rmds, right? So in this particular case, this was a traditional IRA up until 59.5, and it was still earning. And what happened is the account holder wanted to make sure that that account could continue to grow and then be passed along. And so they make a conversion. Whereas if they do not make a conversion, let's say they start taking distributions there at 59.5, and then continue them into 72.5, which they would necessarily have to start 72.5. So you can see that the total account value, cash and assets, if you don't make the conversion, that it's necessarily going to go down. So again, thinking about Roth as a generational wealth tool is something that can be one of your considerations as well. There you go. But, and again, short-term consideration is that when you make the conversion, you are going to be having a tax event. The long-term consideration, you know, I would say that this is really general for everything, is you're thinking about, if you have the ability to do this, using these tools in order to pay the least amount of overall tax on the entire investment scenario, that's the big analysis. Now, a lot of us don't have the ability to think like that. We need a deduction in a certain tax year. We don't have the money to pay for a Roth conversion in a given tax year. So your tax situation has a lot to do with what you can do. But if you're in an area where you have free range, or if you have enough financial means, thinking about using these tools to reduce the overall taxation on a given investment strategy, that's really the scenario that we're talking about through this entire presentation. Okay, so I'm coming up on my hour here, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off. I'm happy to answer questions, so if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the questions box, and I'll definitely hang out a little bit and answer those. But I do want to just let you know that, first of all, I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join me and learn a little bit about Roth IRAs versus traditional, and how Roths are being used to their highest effect. We do a lot of education, so we have learning center options for you. We have events like this one. We have a video library on YouTube, and so it's easy to get to our YouTube channel. And the blog on the website is also excellent, especially when it comes to new legislation or new trends or things in self-directed IRAs. So please do feel free to avail yourself of that. Remember that starting a self-directed IRA so that you can invest in alternative assets is a relatively easy process. Fill out an application with us. It takes usually about 15 minutes. You fund that account, usually via transfer or rollover. So there's no tax and no penalty for those movements of funds. And you have the ability to move between accounts, as we showed with the rollover slide. And you can make contributions as well, as long as you're eligible to do so. So you open your Advanta IRA, you get some money in it, and then you just start investing. So you start looking for the investment that will fit your financial profile, your risk tolerance, the returns that you need, all of those factors that go into an investment. You choose the investment, and we help document that so that it gets to keep the tax advantages of the account type. I will remind everybody that we do have an ongoing, every other week, an event called Pitch, Promote, and Prosper. The next iteration of that is this Friday. It's at noon Eastern time, and it is an open forum for investors, as well as investment issuers and investment service providers. People all tune in. It's live on Zoom. You get to introduce yourself, talk about either the investments you're looking for or the investment that you're offering, and put your information, your contact information, in the chat box. So if there is somebody that has a matching interest, or an interest that is going to help you, then you guys can connect and figure out what it is you want to do. Now, the investment issuers that show up, we do not advocate them, any of them, advocate for them. We don't vet them. It's a free and open forum, but it does give people the opportunity to take a look at different types of investments and have the ability to say, hey, I'm looking for this investment. Or you may have a piece of real estate or something that you want to sell. So you could be the investment issuer yourself. So do understand that it's available to you. It is every other week at Friday at noon Eastern time. And the next one is this Friday. And here's my contact information again, and I'll leave that up as I answer questions. If it's time for you to go about the rest of your day, again, thanks so much for spending some time with us. I hope this was helpful. If this has brought up some additional questions, please go ahead and type them into the question box now, or contact me via phone or email at your convenience. I'm happy to talk to you about anything that I talked about today, or other kind of self-directed IRA information as well. So if you are going to head out for today, thanks again. And if you're going to stay around for questions, I will get to those here momentarily. So the first question is a really good one. It says, does each year's contribution have a 5-year rule? And the answer is no. Each year, each conversion has its own 5-year rule, but each annual contribution does not. So the 5-year clock for your Roth starts in the year of the first contribution, the first annual contribution. And once that, so let's say you make your first contribution to your first Roth on June of 2020. That means that 2020 is your first year, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. So beginning in January the 1st of 2025, you have satisfied the 5-year rule for all of your Roth contributions and for the earnings for that matter, again, assuming you're over 59 and a half. But the 5-year clock for contributions is a one-time thing. The 5-year clock for conversions is for each conversion, but it does not apply to annual contributions. The 5-year clock for contributions is only a one-time thing. And understand this, that if you have multiple IRAs and even if you make contributions to different IRAs, different Roth IRAs, the 5-year clock for all of your annual contributions to all of your Roths started in the year of the first contribution. So don't worry that you've maybe had moved from one Roth IRA to 3 and you started making contributions to the third Roth. That doesn't restart the 5-year clock. It's from the first annual contribution. So that's a great question. So the next question is about what you can put in and what you can take out the following year. So I'm not sure I understand the question exactly. So I'm going to just go back to what I think we're talking about here. Any annual contribution that you make, whether it is money that you can take out without tax and without penalty, no matter what age you are. So let's say you contributed $6,000 in year 1, you contributed $4,000 in year 3, but you didn't make any contributions in year 2 or year 4 or year 5. So you still have the ability to take out that $10,000. So 4 years hence, you can still take out that $10,000 because that's the $6,000 annual contribution you made in one year and the $4,000 that you made in another. Both of those amounts, because they were annual contributions that fit within the limit, can be taken as distribution without tax and without penalty. So there's a question here that says, am I wrong in understanding that a large return doesn't really matter? Isn't it all about the tax rate now versus the tax rate of distribution? Well, it is about the tax rate now versus the tax rate of distribution. However, whether the earnings get taxed or not in the middle definitely has an effect on the total gross taxation. So if you're thinking about the total gross taxation, even if you paid a little bit higher income tax rate by making a Roth contribution or a conversion, if the earnings are enough, that still may mean that the overall investment sequence, meaning whatever account you used, whatever tax you paid, whether it's at the beginning or the end, the earnings that are tax-free in a Roth may counteract that. So let's say that you paid, I don't know, $5,000 of tax on a conversion, and the investment return was good, and you never paid tax on it again. In that investment scenario, and you made a qualified distribution, that means that your total gross taxation on that entire sequence was $5,000. But let's say you didn't convert, and the returns were what they were. And so let's say that the total amount in the account then is, I don't know, $100,000. As you take distributions, unless you are at a 5% tax rate when you take those distributions, that means that let's say you're at 10% tax rate. That means that on the 100 grand, you'd pay 10 grand. Boy, I hope my math is right. So the overall gross taxation on that traditional IRA scenario, and I'm making this wildly simple, so please, just understand it as conceptual. then the overall gross taxation would be more. Now that totally depends on how much tax you paid at the beginning, what the earnings are, and what your income tax rate is at the end. So I would say that it is not just about the income tax rates, it's also about the amount of earnings that are made and whether they're taxed or not. Theoretically, so the next question is, theoretically, I could withdraw all my Roth money after 59 and a half. Absolutely. Well, the fact of the matter is you can always take distribution of any of your IRAs. It's just whether you're willing to live with the consequences. Meaning that if you're under 59 and a half, you're going to have the penalty. But yes, in a Roth, for the entire account to be eligible to be distributed tax-free, you just need to meet two criteria. One, you have to be over 59 and a half, and two, the account or your first account, Roth account, has to have been open for at least 5 years. And that assumes no conversions. If you have conversions, again, there's a 5-year clock for each of those. Can you combine a traditional and a Roth IRA into one self-directed checkbook account? In a manner of speaking, you can combine them, but it looks like this. So your traditional IRA and your Roth IRA are always necessarily going to be separate, again, because they are different tax status. So the IRS is going to make us account for them separately. Now, I have seen LLCs set up as checkbook control as a 2-member LLC rather than a single-member LLC, which is the more common checkbook control setup. And the 2 members are, one is one is the traditional, is 1 member, and the Roth is the other member, right? So they contribute a percentage. I shouldn't say contribute. They both buy into the LLC on a certain percentage, and the percentage is based on a dollar-for-dollar basis. And then the account holder, assuming it's the same account holder, can name themselves manager. And so the 2 accounts are consolidated in one LLC, so they can be managed as one. But the percentage of ownership of the 2 members can't change because those 2 accounts are actually disqualified from one another. So once you set up the percentage of ownership in that LLC between the traditional and the Roth, all proceeds need to be split along those percentage lines. But yes, you can have an LLC that has a member that's your traditional IRA and a member that is your Roth IRA and operate them out of one kind of central pot of money. Can collectible cars or motorcycles be owned in SD IRAs and or Roths? Unfortunately not. And the reason for that is the IRS finds collectibles and those types of things hard to value. And so they thought, well, there's too much ability for people to skew the tax event, and so they're just prohibited. So collectibles are prohibited in all IRAs, whether they be traditional or Roth. Can I convert a portion of my property in my SD IRA to a Roth SD IRA? If you're saying, can you convert, if your traditional IRA owns a property and you want to convert a percentage of that property to a Roth, yes, you can. So what you would do is get an appraisal for the entire amount of the property, and then the retitling exercise, which is what it would be that instead of the titling being 100% owned by Clay's traditional IRA, it would be then 50% owned by, or whatever the percentage is, and I'm just making 50 arbitrarily, 50% owned by Clay's traditional IRA and 50% owned by Clay's Roth IRA. And the tax event would be this: you would get an appraisal for the entire property and pay 50%. 50% of that, the value that I'm converting, would be put on my income tax for that year. But yes, you can do a partial conversion. The other thing I'll mention, since we're talking about it, is if you have a traditional IRA that owns real estate and you want to distribute that in kind, we talked a little bit about that in terms of the vacation home scenario, you can spread that out over a number of years as well. So you can distribute percentages of ownership of a physical property to yourself in a given tax year. That percentage does count against RMDs, and in that way you can actually spread the tax burden of the entire property. So let's say the whole property is going to be worth about $100,000, but you only want to take the tax hit for $20,000 each year for 5 years. Well, you can retitle that property each year, changing the percentage by a percentage of ownership of 20%. And you do have to do appraisals. I think that we would require them every 3rd year in that scenario, to keep up with the value of the property. But you can do in-kind distributions of physical real estate in percentages so that you don't have the whole tax burden all at once. So yes. And just to be clear, the use rules for that property, they only go away after the property is 100% distributed. So if you just distribute even 80, 90%, 99% of it, if you distribute 99% of it, was still 1% owned by your IRA, you and other disqualified persons are still not allowed to use it, according to the IRS. Okay, so that's all I see for questions for now, and I really appreciate them. Those are good questions. And as ideas occur to you, again, me as well as my business development colleagues here at Advanta, we like to hear about these scenarios. Please do run them past us, because we might be able to mention something that we've seen other account holders do, or something for you to think about and to mull over with your legal and financial team when you're considering movements within your account. So happy to help. You see my contact information there on the screen. Please feel free to reach out. That's my direct office line as well as my email. And thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that this was helpful, and enjoy the rest of the day, and happy investing.